Welcome to the Beau Show. Here's a continuation of my conversation with Roger Stone. Well, Roger, let's move on to January 6th, because a lot of stuff going on with you right now. It was alleged that your speech on the 5th somehow had a connection to the events on January 6th. You were subpoenaed, Alex Jones was subpoenaed. Now your phone records have been subpoenaed, and you were countersuing. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I spoke on January 5th to a legally permitted event. I would urge you to go watch the speech, but unfortunately, YouTube and Rumble have both taken it down. I'm proud of that speech. I didn't say anything inappropriate. I certainly didn't.
Why'd they take it down? Because of
I have no
exoneration?
idea. You tell me. Community standards, whatever that means. There's nothing inappropriate in that speech. You can see parts of it on CNN because I did say that I viewed the struggle the country was facing as an epic struggle between good and evil, between dark and light, between the godly and the godless. And I said that if we lose, then I could see America would step off into 1,000 years of darkness. That's an apocalyptic view based on my Christian views. That doesn't advocate violence. There's nothing about violence or lawlessness there, but CNN used that exact clip and said, here is Stone advocating violence. Now, there's nothing inappropriate about those remarks. As far as January 6th is concerned, any assertion that I knew about or was involved in any way in the illegal actions at the Capitol is categorically false. I wasn't on the ellipse. I didn't march to the Capitol. I wasn't at the Capitol. I literally learned about the break-ins at the Capitol when everybody else did, watched it on TV, denounced it immediately on social media because it was counterproductive to what we were attempting to achieve. Quite simply, the whole purpose of January 5th and 6th was to get a 10-day delay in the certification of Joe Biden's election to allow time to examine the anomalies and irregularities in the voting in Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin and Nevada and elsewhere. How is that different than Hillary Clinton's attempt in 2016 to make a presentation to the Electoral College to try to convince them not to certify the election of Donald Trump? Now, they say that the effort to challenge the election results is seditious, that it's an insurrection, that it's treasonous. No, actually, under the First Amendment of the Constitution, it's perfectly legal. Any American has a choice to express their views regarding the outcome of the election. Now, from a realistic political point of view, I did not think we would be successful in winning that 10-day delay, but I did think it was worth making the argument and making the fight.
So, Roger, do you think Mike Pence did the right thing?
I actually do not think so.
What should he have done?
I think that there's a legitimate legal opinion, and obviously lawyers can disagree, but I do think he had the authority to issue a 10-day delay. Some very impressive things that I've read recently, I have reason to believe that Mike Pence was probably undermining Donald Trump from the very beginning. How is it that his chief of staff's wife was one of those who testified against the president in the second Ukraine-based impeachment inquiry? I find that very odd. Now, you do know that during the election, after the famous Billy Bush tape was released, where Trump made inappropriate comments about grabbing women, Mike Pence would not take the presidential candidate's call for 3 days, and Reince Priebus tried to convene the Republican National Committee to basically rescind the nomination of Donald Trump and replace him with Mike Pence. Pence wasn't returning Trump's call because he was waiting for a vote count, waiting to see whether that was plausible. By the way, that effort collapsed. Why Trump would then go on to appoint Reince Priebus, who is the man who gave you Rod Rosenstein, the acting attorney general, who in turn is the man who gave you Robert Mueller. This is a bit of a mystery to me. So I do think Pence had the authority to issue a delay. I don't think Pence had the ability to void the vote. I do think he could have issued a delay in which the vote count in those states could have been more carefully examined. For those who say there is no evidence of voter fraud, there's no evidence whatsoever of irregularity, that's an absurdity. We know that there are probably 700,000 questionable ballots in Arizona. Now, it is conceivable that even taking those into consideration, Biden may have won Arizona by 10,000 votes, which I would concede that immediately. But you can't say that the election was stolen, and you can't say that it was not stolen. What you can say is there's an enormous amount of evidence that required investigation that no unbiased body has ever looked at. No court, no legislative body, and so on. And therefore, it's a question at a minimum.
There are two new books coming out about Kennedy and Nixon, and you're very familiar with this topic. Campaign of the Century by Erwin Gelman and The Nixon Conspiracy by Jeff Shepard. I want you to talk about those books and how they're relevant to today's times, because the Shepard book, I guess he transcribed the famous tape, says that if we really knew about the deep state alliance with the media and Nixon's good faith on those tapes, that he would have easily won the impeachment trial. Does that sound right to you?
I've read that book. I've just finished it. I've also read Jeff Shepard's previous books. He was there. He's a very meticulous attorney. I think he's absolutely right. First of all, Judge Sirica was meeting with the Watergate prosecutors. Without the lawyers for the Watergate burglars, he would have been disbarred for that. He would have been removed for that. He cooked their appeal in advance, so they could not win on appeal. It is absolutely true that John Dean, who, by the way, in his book says that he transcribed all of the Watergate tapes for the first time ever and published them, but he leaves out three crucial conversations in March of 1973 where he lies to the president. So Nixon was basically lied to for 19 months about whether anyone in the White House had a connection to the Watergate break-in. Dean is covering up, in essence, for himself and for Gordon Strachan, who worked for Jeb Magruder. Had we had an internet, an uncensored internet, kind of internet we had in 2016, in 1974, Nixon most definitely would have survived. In terms of Erwin Gelman's book, The Campaign of the Century, a lot of this same material is covered in my book, Tricky Dick, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Richard M. Nixon. I make the case that despite a series of errors in the 1960 campaign, the disastrous debate, Nixon's comeback in the subsequent three debates, which is ignored by history. Yes, it's true that the other debates did not have as large an audience as the first one, but the fourth debate was only about 100,000 households less than the first debate, and by all accounts was Nixon's best debate of the four. Eisenhower coming off the bench and campaigning for Nixon in the closing days also becomes a crucial factor. A compelling case could be made that Nixon won the 1960 election, but it's also true that his bitterness and his resentment about being cheated in 1960 led to the mindset that allowed Watergate to happen. In other words, Nixon and his people vowed never again would they be tricked, never again would they allow the opposition to have greater intelligence than they had. And I think it led to a paranoia that permeated the 1972 campaign, which had the unfortunate result of bringing Nixon down.
Now let's turn to JFK for a minute. Oliver Stone, of course, made the movie JFK, was waiting on bated breath for declassified documents about the Kennedy assassination to be released by Donald Trump, especially in the final days of his presidency. I believe you spoke with him about this, and if you can go at length and tell me, why do you think Donald Trump did not declassify those documents?
Trump, in the end, released about 80% of the documents that were scheduled for release, held back 20%. His public explanation was that they would expose the sources and methods of our intelligence agencies. That's problematic from my point of view. First of all, sources. At more than 50 years later, there's nobody alive currently working in government, very few people alive at all connected to the Kennedy assassination. Secondarily, I'd like to know their methods, if their methods are being used to fool the American people. To say that these documents had to be withheld for national security purposes, well, that includes that they have the assumption that there's some international piece here. Now, Lyndon Johnson went to great lengths. He told Senator Richard Russell, you can hear it in the tapes, he told Earl Warren that there was both Russian and Cuban involvement in Kennedy's assassination. There is no evidence whatsoever of either one. John Kennedy was killed on the basis of a domestic plot. I don't like to use the word conspiracy, a domestic plot. And I make the case in my own book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, that Lyndon Johnson, the man who had the most to gain, Johnson, who was facing not only criminal charges in the Bobby Baker and the Billy Sol Estes case, Johnson, who Kennedy had already begun telling people would be dropped from the ticket in 1964 because of his upcoming criminal indictment. I think he is the common denominator between those who were involved in Kennedy's murder. those being specifically organized crime. Johnson is clearly taking payoffs from Carlos Marcello, pretty well documented. The intelligence agencies. Johnson is the Senate president, the Senate majority leader, when J. Edgar Hoover's budget is formulated and increased greatly. He is also the paymaster for the CIA. As the Senate majority leader, he takes the very rare step of appointing himself to the subcommittee of the Defense Appropriations Committee, where the black box budgets for the CIA are formulated and passed in secret. He's the only Senate majority leader who ever appoints himself to any committee, and he doesn't even appoint himself to the full committee, just appoints himself to the subcommittee where the CIA budgets are formulated. When he leaves the Senate, he replaces himself with Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia, one of his closest political allies. So Johnson can also be tied to Big Texas Oil. Kennedy was trying to repeal the oil depletion allowance, so their motive is clear. I urge you to read my book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. It's a New York Times bestseller. You can find it at Amazon. I think it makes the case.
So if no one alive would be affected by this, and Trump is saying, oh, it's just sources and methods, what do you think's in those documents? Does it implicate the CIA?
I think it implicates our own government. I asked the president directly, not at the time, but more recently, why he didn't let it all go. And by the way, Joe Biden has since essentially taken the same action. So Biden released a little bit of material, but he still withheld the material that the intelligence agencies object most to being released. I asked him why he did that, and he said, you just wouldn't believe what's there. You just wouldn't believe it. I had to do it because you just wouldn't believe how horrible it is. And I said, well, what was it? And he said, well, I'll tell you someday.
It sounds pretty damaging. It sounds explosive.
I think what it will show is that our own government is complicit in the murder of John Kennedy.
Don't you think as Americans we should know that?
We certainly should know that. But there, again, the role that the media played was so different in 1963 than it is today. Even today, with CNN particularly, but the other three networks, pretending that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and he was the sole assassin, 73% of the American people, according to Gallup, do not believe that. I think that's encouraging. Whether we will ever know the full truth of John Kennedy's assassination, I don't know. But I do think that Kennedy, with the advantage of hindsight, was challenging the intelligence agencies. He threatened to shatter the CIA into a million pieces because they had lied to him about the Bay of Pigs. So the motivation of the deep state, in those days they were called the military-industrial complex, they were angry about the Bay of Pigs, which they believed that he botched. What we now know, and is not commonly known, particularly among conservatives, is the Bay of Pigs invasion plan did include air cover. There were supposed to be 29 Panamanian-flagged bombers piloted by Cuban pilots flying out of Panama to support the men assaulting the beach. That was canceled the day before the assault. I think canceled purposely to try to cross-pressure John Kennedy into sending in the U.S. Air Force. Yes, I think there were those who wanted this to conflagrate into a world war. They wanted a confrontation with the Russians. Kennedy went along with the Bay of Pigs only on the condition that he have plausible deniability, that he'd be able to say this was not a U.S.-led invasion, it was an indigenous Cuban uprising. Sending in our Air Force would have blown that cover, and he refused to do it. The CIA official, Charles Cable, who canceled the bombers, just happened to be the brother of Dallas Mayor Earl Cable, a crony of Lyndon Johnson's.
So it all comes back to Lyndon, it seems.
I think so. I think he had motive, means, and opportunity. And in my book, I use eyewitness evidence, fingerprint evidence, and deep Texas politics to make a compelling case.